The antiseptic scent of the emergency room was a constant, a sterile ghost that clung to the back of the throat. It was a perfume of clean suffering, layered with the acrid notes of stale coffee and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of fluorescent lights that seemed to vibrate in Alara Vance's bones. This place, Mercy General's ER, was supposed to be a kingdom of controlled chaos, a bulwark against the tide of human fragility. To Alara, it was a purgatory she had chosen, a place of loud noises and bright lights that were somehow quieter than the silence of her own apartment. She moved with a deliberate, almost painful slowness that her colleagues mistook for hesitation, and her supervisors marked down as incompetence. Her hands, which could field strip a rifle in the dark or place a chest tube in a bucking vehicle, fumbled with the plastic wrapper of an IV catheter. The cheap material crinkled noisily in the relative quiet of Trauma Bay 3. Her posture was a carefully constructed apology, her shoulders slightly stooped, her gaze perpetually aimed at the floor or the task at hand, never meeting anyone's eye for more than a fleeting second. It was a mask of meekness, crafted with the same meticulous precision she once used to pack a wound. "Vance, are you going to get that line in this century, or should I call for a specialist?" The voice was sharp, a whip crack in the air that made a junior tech named Ben flinch. Alara didn't flinch. She simply paused, the crinkling of the plastic stopping. Inside her mind, a separate process was running, a tactical computer that never slept. It identified the voice. Director Helen Thompson, Head of Emergency Services. Tone, condescending, performative. Location, 5 meters, 8 o'clock. Accompanied by the cloying scent of her expensive gardenia perfume, a scent designed to announce her presence long before her sharp, clicking heels did. Alara's internal monologue was a flat, dispassionate stream of data. Threat level, 0. Annoyance level, moderate. Countermeasures, none required. Maintain cover. She looked up, allowing a flicker of what she hoped looked like flustered panic to cross her face. "Sorry, Director, the vein, it's a little tricky." Thompson strode forward, a queen surveying a sloppily managed corner of her domain. She was all sharp angles and expensive fabric, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the cheap, scratchy scrubs Alara wore. "Tricky? It's a garden hose, Vance. A dehydrated college kid with alcohol poisoning. My grandmother could hit that vein from across the room. Let me see." Alara obediently stepped aside, her movement economical and smooth, a predator's grace hidden within the clumsy shuffle. She kept her head down, watching Thompson's hands. They were adorned with perfectly manicured nails, the polish a blood red that seemed entirely too appropriate. Thompson palpated the young man's arm with an aggressive, almost punishing touch. "See? Right there," Thompson said, her voice loud enough for the entire ER staff to hear. "It's about anticipation. It's about confidence. Qualities we seem to be lacking tonight." She jabbed a finger at the prominent cephalic vein. Alara gave a quiet, monosyllabic response. Understood. Inside, she didn't see the kid's arm. She saw a different arm, caked in dust and drying blood, illuminated by the strobing green glow of night vision. She was in the back of a striker, bouncing over the rutted terrain of the Korengal Valley. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone, the screams of the wounded a symphony of crisis. She had placed a 14-gauge needle into a collapsing vein with one hand, while using the other to apply pressure to a sucking chest wound. The memory was as vivid as the linoleum beneath her feet, a ghost limb twitching with remembered adrenaline. She took a slow, controlled breath, the kind she'd practiced for 1,000 hours. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. The ghost receded, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of the ER. Thompson, having made her point, gestured dismissively. "Just get it done. And when you're finished playing phlebotomist, the commode in Bay 1 needs emptying. It seems you're better suited to janitorial duties." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a sharp retreat, leaving a wake of humiliation that Alara was expected to drown in. Ben, the young tech, refused to look at her, his face flushed with a second-hand shame. He busied himself by restocking a supply cart with a furious, unnecessary energy. Alara turned back to the patient. Her hands, now that the director was gone, were perfectly still. The fumbling clumsiness evaporated. With a single, fluid motion, She slid the needle into the vein. There was a perfect flash of crimson in the chamber. She advanced the catheter, withdrew the needle, and secured the line with practiced efficiency. The entire process took less than 5 seconds. The patient, lost in his drunken haze, didn't even stir. She taped the line down, her knuckles brushing against the skin. They were thick, the skin over them ridged with pale, faded scars. A cartographer could have traced a history of violence in those lines, a map of closed-quarters combat and desperate last stands. But here, they were just the clumsy, slow hands of Nurse Vance. Later, near the ambulance bay, she passed a couple of Marines who were waiting to be seen for a brawl-induced broken nose and a sprained wrist. They were loud, full of the boisterous, unshakable confidence of young men in uniform. They'd been in the ER for hours and had seen Alara's meek performance under Director Thompson's fire. "Hey, nurse," one of them called out, the one with the sprained wrist. "You ever think of moving with a little purpose?" His friend, holding a bloody towel to his face, snickered. "Give her a break, man. She's trying her best." The words were laced with the easy condescension of the physically capable for the seemingly inept. Alara didn't respond. She just gave a slight nod in their direction and continued on her way, her worn rubber soles squeaking softly on the polished floor. Her gaze was flat, her face a mask of placid neutrality. But inside, the tactical computer was whirring. Subjects: 2. Male, military, USMC. Status: non-hostile, minor injuries. Posture: arrogant. Assessment: they see the uniform, not the operator. They see the clumsy nurse, not the woman who pulled men like them from the wreckage of blasted IEDs. This is the price of peace. This is the penance. The wall of her discipline was a fortress, built brick by brick from the memories of things she wished she could forget. The insults were just pebbles thrown against it. They made no mark. The hierarchy of the ER was as rigid as any military command structure, but it was built on a foundation of sand. Power came from titles, not from ability. Director Thompson was the apex predator in this ecosystem, her authority absolute. She wielded it not like a scalpel for precise and necessary cuts, but like a club for blunt public beatings. Her insecurity was a palpable thing, a frantic energy she disguised with aggression. She couldn't tolerate competence in her subordinates unless it was a direct reflection of her own leadership. Quiet competence, the kind that didn't announce itself, she perceived as a threat. Alara Vance was the ultimate threat. Thompson seemed to sense this on a primal level, even if she couldn't articulate it. She targeted Alara with a special kind of venom. It wasn't just the public call-outs or the demeaning tasks. The campaign of petty tyranny had escalated. A week prior, Alara had submitted a request for a single day off. It was for a specific date, a Tuesday. It was the anniversary of the day Sergeant Michael Rook Torres had bled out in her arms on a dusty rooftop in Fallujah. It was a day she spent every year in silence, at the small, windswept cemetery where his parents had laid him to rest. It was a pilgrimage, a sacred duty. She had submitted the form electronically, as required. The next day, she checked the schedule. She was rostered for a double shift. When she quietly approached Thompson about it, the director had feigned ignorance, tapping at her computer with a theatrical flourish. "PTO request?" "Vance, I don't have any request from you," Thompson had said, her eyes wide with false sincerity. "You have to remember to actually hit the submit button. The system can be tricky for some people." Alara had stood there, her face a blank slate. She had seen the faint, ghosted image of her own request on Thompson's screen before the director had quickly clicked to another window. She had seen the digital footprint of its deletion. But she said nothing. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood, a statue of compliance, until Thompson waved a dismissive hand. "If you can't handle the technology, perhaps you should stick to paper forms," Thompson had added, a final twist of the knife. "Understood, Director," Alara had replied, her voice a low monotone. She had turned and walked away. But for a single, terrifying second, the wall had cracked. The antiseptic smell of the ER had been replaced by the hot, metallic tang of blood and the coppery dust of Iraq. She had felt the phantom weight of Rook's body in her arms, heard his last, rattling breath. Her jaw had clenched so tightly that a sharp pain shot up into her temple. She had to physically stop in the hallway, placing a hand against the cool wall to steady herself, and force the tactical breathing sequence. In for 4, hold for 4. out for 6. The image receded. The fortress walls were repaired. But a hairline fracture remained. The weight of her anonymity, the price of her quiet life, was becoming heavier. This daily humiliation was a slow-acting poison, and she was beginning to feel its effects. She wanted this quiet life. She had earned it. She had walked through fire and waded through blood to find a place where the loudest sound was a beeping heart monitor, where the only life-or-death decisions involved which gauge of needle to use. She was paying for that peace by allowing a petty tyrant to use her as a whetstone for her own fragile ego. But she was beginning to wonder how much longer she could pay the price. The breaking point was a distant smudge on the horizon, but it was getting closer with every condescending word, every unjust reprimand, every deleted request. The pressure was building, a deep-sea force pressing in on the fragile vessel of her composure. The first sign was the tremor, a low, subterranean vibration that hummed up through the soles of her shoes, making the instruments on a nearby tray rattle like chattering teeth. It was too deep to be a traffic accident on the street outside. Her head snapped up, her body instantly alert, the meek posture forgotten for a fraction of a second. Her eyes, no longer downcast, scanned the ceiling. Then came the sound. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was a deep, resonant boom that felt less like a sound and more like a punch to the chest. It was the voice of a hurricane, a primal roar of displaced air and shattered concrete. The entire building seemed to lurch sideways. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting the ER in a strobing, disorienting dance of light and shadow before half of them went out with a collective pop. A fine white dust, dislodged from the ceiling tiles, began to drift down like a morbid snowfall. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The symphony of crisis paused. The beeping monitors, the humming lights, the chatter, all gone. It was a void. Then, chaos erupted. A nurse screamed. A patient started crying. The backup generators kicked in with a guttural roar, and the remaining lights flickered back to a steady, grim half-light. What was that? Ben's voice was high, cracking with fear. Director Thompson, who had been in her glass-walled office, stumbled out, her face a mask of chalky white terror. Her composure had shattered like cheap glass. "Everyone, stay calm," she yelled, but her voice was a thin, reedy thing, laced with panic. It had the opposite effect. Her fear was a contagion, spreading through the room instantly. The red phone on the main desk, the direct line for citywide emergencies, began to shriek. It was a sound few on the current shift had ever heard outside of a drill. The charge nurse stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Thompson, galvanized by the shrill sound, lurched toward it. She snatched the receiver. "This is Director Thompson at Mercy General." She listened, her eyes growing wider and wider. "Oh God, no." She dropped the phone back into its cradle with a clatter. She turned to the staff, her hands visibly shaking. "Code Black," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then she seemed to find her lungs again. "Code Black, it's a bombing. The federal building downtown. Mass casualties incoming. First wave in 5 minutes." The ER devolved into pure, unadulterated chaos. Thompson began shouting orders, but they were superficial and contradictory. "Get more gurneys. No, clear the bays first. Someone call surgery. We need all hands on deck. Where are the triage tags?" One of the residents, a young doctor named Peterson, just stood there, his face slack with shock. He was frozen, a deer in the headlights of an oncoming disaster. Thompson's frantic, panicked commands were just noise, a soundtrack to the unfolding pandemonium. The controlled environment she ruled with an iron fist had disintegrated into a mob. But in the midst of the storm, there was a single point of stillness. Alara Vance. At the first tremor, her training had taken over. The heavy pressure of her self-imposed meekness, the weight of her anonymity, simply vanished. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reflex, drilled into her by 1,000 hours of brutal, realistic training. The crushing weight was replaced by a crystalline clarity. Her heart rate, which should have been hammering against her ribs, dropped. The frantic shouting and screaming around her faded into manageable static, data points to be processed and filtered. Her senses, once deliberately dulled, sharpened to a razor's edge. She could smell the ozone from the shorted-out lights beneath the scent of antiseptic. She could hear the distinct pitches of panic in each person's voice. Her mind, the tactical computer, was already working. Event: high explosive detonation. Proximity: estimated 2 miles. Initial casualty profile: blast trauma, penetrating injuries from shrapnel, crush injuries, burns. Hospital status: compromised lighting, staff in panic, leadership ineffective. She moved. Her feet, which had shuffled moments before, now rolled heel to toe, a ghost's tread on the slick linoleum. She didn't run. She flowed through the chaos, a river parting around panicked rocks. She went to the main supply closet, her hands moving with a blur of efficiency. She grabbed combat-grade tourniquets, chest decompression needles, and quick-clot gauze, supplies the hospital kept for extreme situations, but which were rarely used and often buried at the back of the shelves. She began laying them out on a mobile cart, creating a trauma station from memory. The first wave of victims arrived not in ambulances, but in the back of police cars and commandeered pickup trucks. The doors of the ER burst open, and the war zone flooded in. The air was instantly filled with the screams of the wounded and the metallic tang of fresh blood. It was a scene from a nightmare. It was a Tuesday night in Kandahar. To Alara, it was just another day at the office. Among the broken bodies and terrified faces was a man in the tattered remains of an army combat uniform. He was being half dragged, half carried by 2 frantic police officers. Blood soaked through his trousers, pulsing from a wound high on his thigh in a terrifying arterial rhythm. His face was pale, his eyes wild with pain and shock. "Get him to Bay 2, Thompson shrieked, pointing with a trembling hand. The officers dumped him onto a gurney. Dr. Peterson, finally shaken from his stupor, rushed over. "We need to get pressure on that. Get me an 18 gauge and 2 liters of saline, wide open." The soldier, delirious, thrashed on the gurney. "Get off me," he roared, his voice surprisingly strong. He shoved Peterson back. "Don't you touch me. No civvies. Get me a real medic." He was a corporal, judging by the singed chevrons on his sleeve. He was bleeding out, dying in front of them, and his own training was fighting against their attempts to save him. He was losing blood and reason in equal measure. Thompson, seeing Peterson fail, grabbed a syringe of sedative. "Hold him down. I'll sedate him." She lunged toward him, her hand shaking so badly that the needle jittered like a seismograph. She was going to waste precious seconds, maybe even miss the vein entirely or cause an embolism. Alara saw it all in a frozen moment of time. The pulsing blood, the shaking hand, the fatal mistake about to be made. This was the point of no return. Her core duty, the one burned into her soul long before she'd ever put on a pair of scrubs, to preserve the life of a fellow soldier, overrode her mission to remain hidden. The fortress wall didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Move. The word was a quiet blade that sliced through the cacophony. It wasn't loud, but it carried an absolute, undeniable authority. It was the voice of a commander on the battlefield. Thompson froze, the syringe poised. She turned, her face a mixture of confusion and fury. "What did you just say to me, Vance?" Alara didn't answer. She didn't have time. She placed her hand on Thompson's shoulder and simply pushed her aside. It wasn't a violent shove, but it was firm, implacable, and utterly dismissive. She snatched the useless syringe from the director's hand and dropped it on a tray. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to behold. The meek, clumsy nurse was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Her posture snapped ramrod straight, her head held high. Her gaze, once flat and evasive, was now hard, analytical, and cold as glacial ice. It swept over the scene, assessing, cataloging, commanding. The mask had not just been dropped, it had been shattered. The ghost had emerged. She knelt beside the gurney, her movements fluid and precise. The corporal, still thrashing, swung a fist at her. She caught his wrist in a grip of iron, her fingers finding the pressure points with innate knowledge. His arm went limp. "Stay still, Corporal," she said, her voice low and calm, a rock in the torrent of noise. "Go to hell," he spat, his eyes blazing with delirious defiance. "I'm not letting some nurse touch me." Alara held his gaze. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. With her free hand, she reached up and unceremoniously rolled up the sleeve of her right scrub top, exposing her forearm. There, stark against her skin, was the ink. It was a tattoo, faded by sun and time, but its design was unmistakable to anyone who had served in that world. It was a stylized skull, wreathed in laurels, with a medic's cross superimposed over it. Beneath it, a simple, elegant scroll bore a single word: Rangers. And below that, almost hidden, was a smaller, more cryptic symbol, the sigil of a unit that didn't officially exist. The corporal's wild eyes focused on the tattoo. The defiance drained out of him, replaced by a wave of slack-jawed disbelief, then dawning reverence. His thrashing stopped. His whole body went still. "Ranger?" he rasped, his voice a choked whisper. He stared from the ink to her face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the cold competence in her eyes, the sheer, lethal stillness of her. "I have you, Corporal," Alara said, her voice devoid of sympathy but full of certainty. "Now let me work." He stared at her for another long second, then gave a short, sharp nod. His body relaxed under her grip. He was hers now. "Go," he breathed. The moment the corporal acquiesced, Alara became a whirlwind of lethal competence. Her hands, which had fumbled with plastic an hour before, were now instruments of impossible speed and precision. One hand shot to his thigh, finding the femoral artery through the blood-soaked fabric by feel alone. She applied pressure with her thumb, a pinpoint of force that immediately staunched the pulsing flow. "Tourniquet, now!" she barked, not looking up. She didn't direct the command at anyone in particular. It was an order issued to the universe, expecting compliance. Ben, the young tech, was standing closest, his eyes wide with awe. Without thinking, he grabbed one of the combat-grade tourniquets Alara had laid out and slapped it into her outstretched hand. He had never seen anything like her. He had been terrified of Director Thompson's blustering authority, but this was different. This was true command. Alara applied the tourniquet high and tight on the soldier's leg, her movements economical and brutal. She twisted the windlass with practiced force, ignoring the corporal's grunt of pain. The bleeding stopped completely. "You," she said, her head snapping up to lock eyes with Ben. "Get me a thoracostomy tray and a 10-gauge needle, and get 2 units of O-neg from the cooler. Run them through the warmer. Go." Ben didn't question. He didn't hesitate. He just turned and ran, a loyal soldier following his new commander. "Peterson!" Alara's voice cut across the bay. The young doctor, who had been watching, stunned, flinched as if struck. "This man has a tension pneumothorax, tracheal deviation, diminished breath sounds on the right. I need you to prep for a chest tube, or I can do it. Your choice." The challenge hung in the air. Peterson, his face pale, simply nodded and began grabbing the supplies, his movements clumsy compared to hers, but at least he was moving. He was following her lead. Alara was already turning away, her mind a tactical map of the entire ER. She moved from patient to patient, a surgeon of chaos. Her triage was swift, ruthless, and brutally effective. She placed a black tag on a man with an obvious, catastrophic head injury without a second glance. He was gone, and resources were needed for the living. She slapped a green tag on a woman crying hysterically with only superficial cuts, directing her to the waiting area with a sharp, "You can wait." She came to a man gasping for air, his face turning a dusky blue. His throat was swelling rapidly from an inhalation injury. The airway was closing. "We need to intubate," a nurse cried. "No time," Alara stated flatly. "Larynx is crushed." She scanned the nearby trays. The cricothyrotomy kit was missing, likely grabbed in the initial panic and misplaced. "Scalpel," she ordered. No one moved. They were frozen, staring. "Scalpel!" A nurse numbly handed her one. Alara's eyes scanned the room, then landed on Dr. Peterson's breast pocket. "Pen." Peterson, confused, handed her his ballpoint pen. In 3 seconds, Alara had disassembled it, discarding the ink cartridge. With one hand, she palpated the man's throat, finding the cricothyroid membrane. With the other, she made a swift, precise, horizontal incision. There was a gush of blood, and then a miraculous whistling sound as air entered the man's lungs. She inserted the hollow plastic casing of the pen into the hole, creating a makeshift airway. The man's color began to return from blue to a healthy pink. She had just saved his life with a knife and office supplies. All the while, Director Thompson stood on the sidelines, a ghost in her own kingdom. Her authority had evaporated. She tried to shout to regain control. "Vance, you are not certified for these procedures. You will stop this instant. That is an order." No one was listening. The entire staff, from the senior doctors to the junior techs, was moving to Alara's rhythm. They had recognized true competence, the calm eye in the center of the hurricane, and they had instinctively fallen in line. The established chain of command had crumbled, bypassed in favor of a leader who was actually leading. Thompson's voice was just impotent raging, the sputtering of a failed engine. She was irrelevant, a powerless spectator to a masterclass in crisis management. Hours bled into one another. The initial flood of victims slowed to a manageable stream. The chaos, under Alara's command, had been forged into a ruthlessly efficient system. The living were stabilized, the dying were made comfortable, and the dead were treated with a quiet reverence. The ER was no longer a scene of panic. It was a well-oiled machine, humming with the quiet confidence of a team that had been through the fire and emerged intact. Alara, her scrubs stained with the blood of a dozen strangers, did a final walkthrough. The corporal was stable and on his way to surgery. The man with the pen in his throat was breathing steadily, waiting for a proper tracheostomy. The symphony of crisis had been conducted, and the final notes were fading into a weary calm. That was when Director Thompson made her move. She had been stewing in her office, her face a thundercloud of fury and humiliation. She saw Alara standing alone for a moment, wiping her face with a rough paper towel. "Vance, my office. Now," Thompson hissed, her voice low and venomous. Alara looked at her, her eyes heavy with an exhaustion that went far beyond physical. She gave a slow nod and followed Thompson, the quiet, obedient nurse once more, but the illusion was gone forever. Everyone who saw them knew who held the real power. Inside the office, Thompson closed the door and turned, her entire body vibrating with rage. "You're fired," she spat, the words tasting like victory to her. "Effective immediately. Your gross insubordination, your reckless and uncertified procedures. You are a liability and a danger. You will be lucky if you are not facing criminal charges and the loss of your nursing license. Pack your things and be escorted from the premises." Alara stood there, saying nothing. She felt a profound weariness settle over her. So this was the end of her quiet life. It had been shattered, not by a bullet or a bomb, but by the ego of a petty tyrant. She had known this was a possible outcome. She had accepted it the moment she pushed Thompson aside. As Thompson opened her mouth to continue her tirade, the office door swung open without a knock. A man stood in the doorway, and his presence immediately sucked all the air out of the room. He was in a crisp Army Class A uniform, the chest laden with ribbons that told a story of a long and decorated career. A silver eagle adorned each shoulder. He was a full colonel. He moved with a quiet, absolute confidence that made Thompson's aggressive posture look like a child's tantrum. His gaze was sharp, analytical, and missed nothing. He ignored Thompson completely, his eyes scanning the room until they found Alara. A flicker of recognition, and something like relief, crossed his face. "Vance," he said, his voice a calm baritone that carried immense weight. "I had a feeling I'd find you here." Thompson, momentarily stunned by the intrusion, found her voice. "Excuse me, Colonel, but this is a private disciplinary meeting. This nurse is—" The colonel turned to gaze on her so cold it could have frozen fire. He cut her off without raising his voice. "I know who she is, Director." He took a step into the room, his eyes never leaving Thompson's. "And I know who you are. The hospital board is already aware of your conduct during tonight's incident." He turned his attention back to Alara, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I was at the command post downtown when the reports started coming in. Heard there was a Ranger-qualified medic among the wounded, Corporal Evans. When they told me he was here, and that he was stable, I had to see for myself. They said a nurse saved him. A nurse who moved like a ghost and commanded the room like a general. They said she showed him some ink." He gestured toward her arm. "I saw your name on the transfer manifest and put two and two together." Thompson, desperate to reassert her authority, stepped forward. "Colonel, with all due respect, this woman is a low-level staff nurse. She performed procedures far beyond her scope of practice. She is a danger to this hospital." The colonel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Director Thompson," he said, turning his full, undivided attention to her. It was like being targeted by a weapons system. "This low-level staff nurse is Sergeant First Class Alara Vance, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, with special attachment to Joint Special Operations Command. She isn't just a medic, she's one of the most decorated combat medics of the last decade. The procedures you call reckless are techniques she helped develop. She wrote half the protocols on advanced trauma care that your doctors are probably still reading on their tablets. The only danger in this hospital tonight, Director, was your panic and your ego." He took another step closer. "Corporal Evans is alive because of Sergeant Vance. Several other people in your ER are alive because of her. And the first coherent thing that Corporal said to me when I saw him in pre-op was not about his injuries. It was about his profound disappointment in your hospital's leadership." The colonel's voice dropped, becoming even quieter, yet more menacing. "He also told me that you tried to inject him with a sedative while shaking so badly you couldn't have hit the floor if you dropped the needle. He said Sergeant Vance had to physically remove you to save his life. Is that correct?" Thompson's face had gone from red with fury to a pasty, mottled white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was broken. "I've already had a conference call with the chairman of the board and the head of surgery," the colonel continued, his tone now flat and final. "They have reviewed testimony from Dr. Peterson, from a tech named Ben, and from half a dozen other staff members who watched you freeze and then watched Sergeant Vance take command. You are terminated, effective immediately. Your credentials are under review, pending a full state medical board investigation into gross negligence. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building." As if on cue, 2 uniformed hospital security guards appeared in the doorway behind him. They looked grimly at Thompson, avoiding her eyes. Her reign was over. She stared at Alara, her eyes filled with a toxic cocktail of hatred and disbelief. Then, without a word, she turned and let the guards lead her away, a queen deposed and exiled from her own kingdom. The office was silent for a long moment. The colonel, whose nameplate read Thorn, looked at Alara. The hard lines of his face softened with a deep, weary respect. "He also said to tell you that your bedside manner is still terrible," Colonel Thorn said, the corner of his mouth twitching into a half smile. For the first time that night, a genuine emotion flickered across Alara's face, the ghost of a smile. The dry, ironic humor was a language she understood far better than platitudes. It was a message from one soldier to another. The weariness returned, settling deep into her bones. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only the ache. "The quiet life didn't last long, sir," she said, her voice rough. "It never does for people like us, Vance," Thorn replied gently. "We try to walk away, but the world keeps finding reasons to pull us back. You can't hide this kind of light under a bushel." He paused, his expression turning serious. "We didn't know where you'd gone after you mustered out. Just that you wanted to disappear. But we need you. I need you." He gestured around at the now quiet ER, at the testament to her skill. This was a masterclass, but it shouldn't have to happen this way. You shouldn't have to fight the very people you're trying to save. He locked his gaze with hers. "There's a position open at Fort Sam Houston, head instructor for the Combat Trauma Center. They're training the next generation of medics, the ones who will be going where you've already been. They need someone who doesn't just know the book. They need someone who wrote it, someone who has lived it. The job has your name written all over it, Alara. It's a chance to come home." Alara looked past him, through the glass wall of the office, at the ER she had just tamed. It was orderly, quiet. Ben was competently changing an IV bag. Dr. Peterson was confidently debriefing a junior nurse. She had, in the space of a few hours, reshaped this place. But it wasn't her place. Her anonymity was gone. The penance was paid. She thought of the young, terrified faces that would soon be heading into the same hell she had crawled out of. She thought of Rook and all the others. She could not save them, but she could teach their replacements how to save others. Her gaze returned to Colonel Thorn. The hesitation, the meekness she had worn like a heavy cloak, was gone for good. In its place was the quiet, unshakable certainty of a master who had found her purpose once more. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "When do I start?"